Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this installment of Orthodoxy in Islam, a webinar series that is one of the many initiatives of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. The Fordham Center facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world broadly understood. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit its website at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy, and also the newly designed website for the center's blog, Public Orthodoxy. We would also encourage you to follow us on YouTube and to share this and other videos with anyone who might benefit from it. And please don't forget to like our content online so that others can find it more easily. Our webinar today is called Multifaith Ukraine. Religious pluralism is one of Ukraine's most distinguishing characteristics. This webinar will provide an expert overview of this important topic with a focus on the relationship between Orthodox Christians and Muslims in Ukraine. Our discussion will begin by introducing the general topic of interreligious and Muslim-Christian relations in Ukraine, including basic information about the major religious communities and religious pluralism in general. It will then focus on the indigenous Muslim community of Ukraine, the Crimean Tatars, and their relationship with the Orthodox Christians in particular, including the fascinating history of parallel worship in local religious sites in Crimea, their history of their relationship in general, up to the present day. The discussion will conclude with reflections on current interreligious developments in Ukraine, reflections on place of Muslim-Orthodox interaction in Ukraine, in the very long history of Muslim-Orthodox relations more generally, and of course, answering any questions from our audience members. For those of you who have questions, please put those questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now for some information about our distinguished panelists. Dr. Olena Sobolieva is a senior researcher at the Research Institute of Ukrainian Studies in Kiev, head and co-founder of the Center for Applied Anthropology, and is currently working as a visiting researcher at the Institute of Social Anthropology, University of Basel. She's a researcher in the field of anthropology and ethnology, focusing on three major topics: the Crimean Tatar community in Ukraine, their deportation and repatriation, Islamic studies, and migration processes in urban areas. She's the author of two books on Crimean Tatar culture, Crimean Tatar wedding, traditional forms and transformations, and Crimean Tatar cuisine. Dr. Catherine Wanner is professor of history, cultural anthropology, and religious studies at Pennsylvania State University. She's the author of Burden of Dreams, History and Identity in Post-Soviet Ukraine, Communities of the Converted, Ukrainians and Global Evangelism in 2007, previous book, 1998. And her most recent project, Everyday Religiosity and the Politics of Belonging in Ukraine, published just last year. She's also the co-editor of Religion, Morality, and Community in Post-Soviet Societies, 2008, editor of State Secularism and Lived Religion in Soviet Russia and Ukraine, 2012, co-editor of Anthropologia Religii, Porівняльні studii i Prikarpatia do Kavkazu. Forgive my pronunciation, I forgot to look at that beforehand, in 2019, and editor of three collections of essays on religion and resistance during the Maidan protests. Her research has been supported by awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council, among others. In 2020, she was awarded the Distinguished Scholar Prize for the Association for the Study of Eastern Christianity. And I'm Dr. Phil Dorroll, Associate Professor of Religion at Wofford College in South Carolina, USA. My research focused on the history of modern Islamic theology in Turkish, classical Islamic systematic theology in Arabic, and Eastern Christian theology in classical Arabic. My book, Islamic Theology in the Turkish Republic, is published recently. Articles and writings of mine have showed up in Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Contemporary Islam, Journal of Islamic Studies, and Fordham's Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies, and their blog, Public Orthodoxy. I work now on Islamic theology and the relationship between Muslims and Christians in the Orthodox and Muslim world. And some of our research in Islamic theology has been translated into Albanian, Bosnian, and Turkish. So without further ado, please let me turn over the floor to Dr. Catherine Wanner to begin our conversation. And thank you all again for coming.
Well, thank you, Phil, for the invitation to be here. I think this is a tremendously important topic, and I thank you for your attention to addressing it. Among the many reasons that make Ukraine such a fantastically interesting place to study is its religious landscape, which is full of counterintuitive, paradoxical, and continually evolving developments. It continues to change and and in turn be a changing force for Eastern Christianity more broadly. And I think one of the reasons why that's the case is because there are several factors that really distinguish the religious landscape in Ukraine from other countries that have predominantly Orthodox populations. So in Ukraine, about at least 2/3 of the population is Orthodox. But it's important to note that, for example, before the invasion, the largest bloc of Orthodox believers in Ukraine continued to identify as just Orthodox or просто православный. That is to say that although there was a spectrum of Orthodox churches within Ukraine, the single largest group of believers in Ukraine reaffirmed an allegiance to a confessional tradition and not to a denominational structure within Eastern Christianity. Ukraine was distinguished itself by this spectrum of Orthodox churches. Of course, that religious landscape began to change with the amassing of Russian forces. And so 3 years after the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the number of people who claimed an allegiance to this particular denomination exceeded those who claimed to be просто православный or just Orthodox. I mention this because this kind of diversity and pluralism and very elastic forms of allegiance that the Orthodox have exhibited is really indicative of the broader religious landscape in Ukraine. So although there remain at this point 2 predominant Orthodox churches in Ukraine, the exact relationship between the two and their exact relationships more broadly and specifically concerning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, what kind of a relationship it has or will have with the Russian Orthodox Church, all of that remains to be seen. We are in a moment of tremendous transformation right now. So for those of us who are interested in Orthodoxy and in the region more broadly, I think there are several points that that are distinctive in the Ukrainian case and that promise to shape the eventual institutional configuration that takes root within Ukraine concerning Eastern Christianity, but concerning a wide spectrum of religious groups more broadly. Excuse me. The first thing I would like to mention is that there are a wide variety of minority religious groups within Ukraine. Those religious groups are minority in the sense of their numeric presence. Excuse me one second. However, their numeric presence does not reflect the impact and influence they have within Ukrainian society. They have, for example, a tremendous influence when it comes to social and political legislation. Excuse me, these religious groups are highly influential in matters ranging from historical interpretation to the development of key initiatives such as the chaplaincy, as well as articulating quite pronounced support for Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian nationhood. And that concerns religious minorities within Ukraine, as well as their co-religionists, be they within the Ukrainian diaspora or in other communities more broadly. So the first point I would like to make is that religious minority communities, including Muslim communities, have an influence and a presence in Ukrainian society that far exceeds their numeric presence within the society. So now I'd like to think about how and why this is possible and how this kind of influence has arisen. So although minority religious groups tend to have a strong regional base, they nonetheless operate nationally throughout Ukraine. And what I mean by that is that when one looks at regional variation within Ukraine, one of the key factors in defining that regional variation is the presence and preponderance even of minority religious communities. Olena will speak about Crimean Tatars, who obviously are based primarily in Crimea. And yet their influence and their presence can be felt throughout Ukraine. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is the largest of all minority religious communities, it has about 9% of the population, they're predominantly located in 3 Western Ukrainian oblasts. However, the seat of their archiepiscopal see since August 2005 is located in Kiev, and that reflects its presence within the capital, and once again, its active participation in the crafting of a variety of forms of legislation. I could go on with additional examples. The Protestants primarily are located in eastern and southern Ukraine. Jewish communities, places like Odessa, are legendary for being the site of Jewish culture. And yet Dnipro, for example, has the largest Orthodox center. And of course, Uman is the site of Hasidic pilgrimages. So even though those Jewish communities have certain cities or certain regions where their presence begins to inform the local culture, their presence too throughout the country is unquestionably national. So in one level, this is what gives, this contributes to this kind of national presence, and yet it contributes to informing the regional variation within Ukraine. Another point I would like to raise, and this I think minority religious groups have played a key role in influencing what could be described as a fairly ecumenical religious landscape. And what I mean by that is that, for example, the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations is a group that effectively brings together a wide spectrum of religious leaders and is very influential in making pronouncements on a variety of social and political issues. And they have been very active when it comes to participating in events such as certainly the Maidan, for example, in 2013, 2014, and even more recently in calling upon religious leaders worldwide to make pronouncements on this war as being a just war and therefore worthy of support from a wide spectrum of religious communities. The All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations has also been helpful in terms of reaffirming the rights of a wide range of religious minorities, who not only then are allowed to take root on Ukrainian territory, but even over the years, in the 30+ years since independence, these religious minority communities have been able to thrive. And this is in part because Ukraine has signed the major international treaties on religious freedom, which means that Ukrainian legislation recognizes the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, as well as obliges Ukrainian judges to apply precedents created by this court in deciding any kind of future cases. And what's more, the EU-Ukrainian Association Agreement includes provisions to strengthen respect for human rights and reaffirm a commitment to non-discrimination of minorities, as well as a respect for diversity. So all of this conspires to create a certain kind of atmosphere of ecumenicism, which, as I mentioned earlier, I began by speaking about Orthodox communities. You see sort of a spectrum of ways of being Orthodox, and this then gets replicated on a larger level as a broad understanding of a way of being religious. What's more, this ecumenicism serves as a counterpoint to the Russian advancement of the Ruski Mir, or Russian world, as a paradigm for organizing not just religious, but even church-state relations more broadly in the region. In Ukraine, based on this spirit of ecumenicism, you have the advancement of the Kievska tradiция, or the Kiev tradition, which is founded on the premise of ecumenicism and a broad embrace of certainly Eastern and Western forms of Christianity, but also a variety of other religious confessions, including Islam. All of this then allows then for religious communities, be they minority or majority, to have this kind of influence in social and political life. And an additional point is that each of these, especially minority religious communities, are not only operating as islands, or they tend to be embedded in transnational networks or even in global religious institutions. And so minority religious communities have the ability to call on both the resources and the expertise of co-religionists across the world. And so we see this, for example, in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which of course is part of the Holy See, and it connects it to the Catholic Church worldwide. We see this with, and of course that then allows for very strong participation of Caritas, a humanitarian aid organization, to be very active in Ukraine these days. We see this in terms of Protestant groups, for example, that call on their co-religionists primarily in North America, but not exclusively there, to provide expertise when it comes to developing the chaplaincy. First and foremost these days, the military chaplaincy, but medical chaplains and so on and so on. In other words, this is one way in which minority religious groups then are able to influence policies within Ukraine, as well as to enhance their presence within Ukrainian society. Just as a final point, I would suggest that given this moment of extraordinary challenge to Ukraine under wartime conditions and the enormous changes that are occurring within Eastern Christianity, I believe it will be non-Christian religious leaders, including Muslim leaders, who will play a key role in driving the direction of certainly post-war recovery, given once again the access they have to these global religious communities and to their transnational networks. But also I believe they will begin to influence the eventual position that Orthodoxy begins to take in Ukraine, and specifically to influence answers to really the ultimate question that one is looking at these days when considering Ukraine. And that is whether or not the war will compromise the religious freedoms and tolerance that had characterized Ukrainian society prior to the war beginning in February 24th, 2022. One wonders if the public sphere will remain dominated, as I've argued elsewhere, for example, by an effective atmosphere of religiosity that allows for a flourishing of multiple religious organizations, or if the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, or perhaps the Orthodox churches more broadly, will assume a privileged place in Ukrainian society and within the halls of Ukrainian government, such that the successes that had been achieved in the arena of freedom of conscience and toleration for diversity are dispossessed from political culture and become yet another casualty of war. These are among the issues that I think we are all studying when it comes to Ukraine and this war. But regardless of whatever the specific issue one focuses on, there is but no doubt that minority religious communities, in spite of their small numeric presence in Ukraine, will play a far outsized role in shaping the answers that emerge to those questions.
Thank you very much. That's very, very helpful information and context. I appreciate it. Let me now turn it over to Dr. Olena Sobolieva for some more specific information about Crimean Muslims.
Thank you very much for including my talk in this seminar. It's a big honor for me to participate and to present my research to this audience. And the main, I will turn to my talk. The main topic of my today's talk is practices of shared or parallel pilgrimage near Crimean sacred objects. But before I turn to the main topic, I would like to talk about the particular context of Crimean history. So the Crimean Peninsula has a rather diverse landscape, and the Crimean Tatars are indigenous people of the Crimea. At the beginning of 20th century, Crimean Tatar lived as neighbors with representatives of other confessional and ethnic groups, for example, with Orthodox, Greeks, Ukrainians, Russians, Armenians, Romanians, and also with other Muslim ethnic groups, with Romes and Turks, and with ethnic groups who practiced various forms of Judaism, for example, Karaims and Krimchaks. They also are indigenous people of Crimea. Household culture and also religious culture of Crimean Tatars and the other ethnic groups differed significantly depending on their place where they lived, in the arid steppe, in mountains, by the seashore, in towns, or in villages. Different ethnographic groups lived in different parts of peninsula. For example, sub-ethnic groups of Crimean Tatars, Nogais, they were inhabitants of the steppes together with Russians and with Ukrainians. Tats, it is also sub-ethnic group of Crimean Tatars. They lived in middle mountain range together with Greeks, with Armenians, and also with Russians and Ukrainians. And the Yaluboylu, sub-ethnic group of Crimean Tatars, they lived on the southern coast of Crimea and neighboring with Orthodox Greeks at this area. So at that time, population of Crimea was rather heterogeneous. Crimean Tatars, they are mostly Sunni Muslims, and also various Sufi fraternities have been playing an important role in Crimea since Middle Ages. But in 20th century, Crimea was a testing ground for demographic experiments of the Soviet authorities and an arena of mass violence, such as collectivization, political repressions, and mass deportations. Cultural landscape and demographical landscape and also identity of different ethnic groups and Crimean Tatars as well changed dramatically after the deportation in 1944. So this act of deportation was starting point of a number of complex social transformation in the region. Formal reason for mass deportation of Crimean Tatars was the accusation of the whole community for the betrayal of the Soviet motherland and cooperation with Nazi army. And according to a secret decree of the State Committee of Defense of the USSR, the operation of deportation of Crimean Tatars started on May 18, 1944. So over a few days, according to archival official data, more than 191,000 of people were deported from Crimea to Central Asia republics and some other remote areas of Soviet Union. So Crimean Tatars was transported in cattle wagons, and often children and old people couldn't withstand this journey and died on their way to Central Asia. And also, I like to say that not only Crimean Tatars were deported from Crimea. During few days in June 1944, NKVD authorities deported from Crimea to special settlements all families of Greeks, Armenians, and Bulgarians in the number of 38,000 of people. So the reason of deportation of this ethnic groups also was the cooperation, was declared cooperation of Nazi army. So since Crimean Tatars were expelled from the ancestral lands, not only Crimean Tatars, as we can see, the Soviet government started an ideological transformation of Crimean cultural landscape. Soviet authorities launched the process of renaming places with Turkic names in the middle of the 20th century. Also, Muslim cemeteries and mosques had been either destroyed or rebuilt. Soviet authorities began to inhabit abandoned Crimean territories. Immigrants from the central regions of Russia were brought to Crimea to populate deserted villages. But Soviet authorities didn't limit to demographic and landscape transformation. At that time, a gradual process of eliminating and stigmatizing Crimean Tatars and other deported and repressed ethnic groups in history textbooks began. Those a few decades later, little reminded of the Crimean Tatars community on the peninsula. And I also want to make one remark. All these actions of Soviet government can be easily placed in the frame of settler colonialism. So this renaming of native names of some objects, then deportation and compensatory repopulation of these territories. So now I will turn to main topic of my talk, practices of sharing and of sacred space in Crimea. Muslim shrines in Crimea called Aziz or Azizler. And so these Muslim shrines and also several Christian monasteries and churches have always been places of parallel or mixed pilgrimage in Crimea. There also exists a kind of sacred landscape objects, mountains, valleys, which has integrated shrines of several confessional communities. For example, in the near Bakhchisarai in Mariam Dere Valley, in a distance of 2 kilometers, there are sacred sites of 3 religions. One of these sites situated there is Ghazi Mansur Aziz. It is destroyed now. It is a Muslim place of pilgrimage with dervish tekke, with tomb and with healing water. Not far from this place, you can walk around and see, there is a Christian monastery and also a Karaite cemetery in Yosifat Valley. Also there are other shrines which combine sacred places of both religions. For example, Muslim Inkerman Aziz was also located near Orthodox monastery of Inkerman. And also in written sources of 19th and 20th century, we can find a number of examples of sharing sacred objects. For example, in written sources, there is information that Crimean Tatars very often participated in the celebration of dedication days of large Orthodox churches. In the source of 19th century, we can read the following about the dedication day for the Orthodox Church near Bakhchisarai. I will quote, a special gathering of people happens in August 15 on the day of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary and on the eve of that day. Not only all the Christians of the nearest towns and villages, but many of the Tatars revere this day and celebrate it together with Christians. People in dense crowds stand on the ledges and mountain slopes. Everyone has lighted candles in their hands. And on the opposite rocks from the side of this valley, Roms and Tatar. So Roms in Crimea, they're also Muslims. Roms and Tatars are lighting fires. Around them, in picturesque groups, stands Tatar wives with white chadars, Tatar girls with bright decorated hats, shining with gold coins. Everything is colorful. Everything is on the fire this festive evening. So there are a lot of such motifs in written sources of that period, and also there is also legends about support of Christian cults by ruling Muslim Hungary dynasty. Those in several Western European chronicles of the 16th, 17th century, we can come across a plot in which Crimean Khan Haji Girey made an offering before every military campaign with lighting a candle in the Christian church in Bakhchisarai. So common pilgrimage was also observed in near famous shrine Kırk Aziz in Belogorsk district. It is a central mountainous part of peninsula. Worship was held in parallel by representatives of several religious groups. Two synonymous legends were also presented, however, with opposite religious connotation. In Muslim version, 40 believers who were killed by enemies while reading the Quran are buried here. In the Christian version, 40 young men died while reading the gospel at the hands of Turks. So as we can see, mixed or parallel religious practices near sacred objects were quite widespread in that period, 19th and beginning of 20th century. This region has always been characterized by cultural multiplicity. Therefore, members of local ethnic and religious communities demonstrated various forms of reception and religion of other. And also, this phenomena is also presented in other territories and in other places with mixed population. For example, in Balkans, Asia Minor, and in Palestine, where boundaries between different confessions are more transparent. Also, I would like to focus on following question. How is intercommunal interaction reflected in the collective memory of Crimean Tatars? In my interviews, I mostly record my interviews in Crimea from 2006 till 2011. And also I continued my field work, but in Kiev, because I have no access to the field after annexation of Crimea by Russia Federation. So, in my interview, there are a number of examples which illustrate intercommunal interaction in locations with mixed Christian and Muslim population, both in everyday life and in ceremonial time. My interlocutors talked about the communication between Muslims and Christians during ritual periods. For example, there is really widespread talks about that ethnic neighbors congratulated each other on religious holidays, Christian Trinity, Christmas, Easter, and Muslim Uraza Bayram, Kurban Bayram. An informant from village Kos, it is southern coastal part of Crimea, described an example of shared religious practices in Moscow. Referring to his words, Christians were allowed to visit the mosque together with Muslims on Friday or in any other day, and pray in the way they could according to Orthodox tradition. He said that at that time, a church, so Orthodox Church was not functioning, and that's why Muslim Crimean Tatars, they give such possibility for the ethnic and confessional neighbors to come to Moscow. Also, narratives recorded during my field research contains a number of sharing sacred space motifs and stories about interactions of representatives of different religions near Muslim shrines. All of these examples can be divided in two groups. One of these groups is stories about joint or parallel worship at a holy place, and also the stories about sacrilege committed by representatives of other denominations. I will stop on first group. For example, one of my interlocutor told me a story about Christian woman who took care of Muslim holy site, Karli Aziz, at the time while Crimean Tatars were in exile. And quote, after we were deported, an old woman took care of that place. She was a Russian woman. All the time she visited and cleaned up this site. After her death, everything was destroyed. This example shows that Muslim Crimean Tatars, it is really important for them to emphasize that their holy sites, shrines, Aziz there was also in a big respect with the Christian population of the peninsula. Also, there are a lot of motifs about pilgrimage by local Christians to Muslim shrines in the Soviet time. Exactly in that time when Crimean Tatars were in exile. For example, there is a legend or story about healing of the head of the collective farm, kolkhoz. So he's a Soviet functionary. So he was healed near Muslim shrine, and as a sign of gratitude, he tidied and cleaned everything around this shrine, destroyed grave, but he placed the tumble stone incorrectly, and so Crimean Tatar emphasized this fact. Today, Aziz Lair or Muslim shrines are as sacred objects are more than just the places of religious practices. They have become a strong ethnic and religious symbols for Crimean Tatars. I think that they legalize Crimean Tatars on their historical territory. According to Crimean journalist from Crimean Reporter, Aziz Lair are now the material manifestation of spiritual culture of Crimean Tatars. And after Crimean Tatars, after their repatriation, they started the process of refining these holy places, rebuilding them. And for example, I can present here a quotation from my interview. Old woman was telling me, I know this place since childhood. She's talking about shrine near her native village. It's like my home. Before my parents died, all the time, up to the end of their lives, they had been saying, it is not our homeland, the Crimea is our homeland. Do not forget it. I prayed to God and asked him, if we go to the Crimea, first of all, we will set a foot on the fortress. A fortress is the place where this shrine is situated. We will go to this Aziz and read a prayer. And thanks God we came here. I have been near the fortress 2 or 3 times, and every day I pray to this Aziz. So also this Aziz, it's not only a grave, it's also a holy person, saint, to which Crimean Tatars make a prayer in their everyday lives, and everyday praying. So restoration and local pilgrimage after the repatriation was the beginning of the sacred landscape reconstruction, not only for Crimean Tatars, but also for representatives of other religions and ethnic groups of the peninsula. But but it is more about the way local intellectuals reflected upon the cultural and spiritual heritage of Crimea as a common space for members of different ethnic groups and religions. Most frequently, this process is reflected in the local history studies and tourism literature. But also this process of restoration of sacred sacred Muslim landscape of Crimea. This process led to, I would say, to increasing tension and aggravation of conflict between representatives of different ethnic groups on the peninsula. So I will slowly go to my conclusion, and I want to say and emphasize that this fact that ethnodemographical changes that took place in Crimea in the 20th century led to a complete deconstruction of ethnic and confessional boundaries on the territory. Consequently, during the past 50 years, the representatives of two dominant ethno-confessional groups of the peninsula, Muslim Tatars and Orthodox Russians and Ukrainians, they in fact had to entirely rebuild their models of coexistence and neighborhood. However, after Crimean Tatars come back to their ethnic lands, it was impossible to avoid conflict between different kinds of memories and identities. There are memories of the repatriates and of the local Slavic population. For Crimean Tatars, local Russians are settlers or immigrants who settled in empty buildings abandoned by Crimean Tatars after deportation. They have nothing in common with historical memory, customs, past of Crimean Tatars. But however, this does not apply to the Russians and Ukrainians who had lived with Crimean Tatars before the deportation. In my interview, they are presented a lot of stories about witnesses of Crimean Tatars, Christian witnesses, Ukrainian and Russian, about presence of Crimean Tatars on the peninsula before Second World War, before the act of deportation. And also for Russian and Ukrainian settler of the peninsula who came here after deportation, Crimean Tatars are also not native. They don't remember them on the peninsula and they everyday environment. They perceived Crimean Tatars as foreigners or as some ethnic groups which can be dangerous and for Christian Tavrida. So this like Russian myth, a historical myth about the past of Christianity in Tavrida, in Crimea. According to this myth, Crimean Tatars are the direct descendants of the Mongol nomads, and it denies their right to consider themselves indigenous people and to consider Crimea Peninsula their homeland. So, as a conclusion, I would like to say that the traditions of interconfessional neighborhood and practices of sharing sacred objects in Crimea are widely reflected both in literature sources and in collective memories of Crimean Tatars, but these practices suffered greatly during all these demographical experiments and violence in Crimea during the 20th century. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, that's so fascinating. There's so much I could say or mention about that. Absolutely fascinating. I appreciate that very, very much. I'll give people a time to post some questions they would like to. Until that happens, I'd like to say a few things myself. And again, there's so many interesting things, I don't even know where to start. But I really appreciate your point about you can compare this with other multi-religious societies in Palestine, the Balkans. One thing I talk with my students a lot about in class is exactly the practices you're describing, people worshiping near or even with each other. You point out an example where there was even a case you mentioned where Orthodox Christians were given a mosque to pray in because they didn't have access to a church building, which these sorts of things, and like you said, there's parallel worship, there's shared worship, there's different ways that people negotiated these boundaries. I try and tell people a lot, this, as you point out as well, this was so normal for many, many centuries. I mean, this is a part of pre-modern life that for all kinds, exactly the reasons you're describing, modern nationalizations and forced deportations and violence was sort of obliterated, but for many places was just, especially among Orthodox Christians and Muslims, I like to always emphasize, especially in the Ottoman Empire and former Russian imperial territory, was just routine for people for century after century. And it's just fascinating to learn and think about it, given how much of it was taken away. Second thing that it just came to me, at least, was so much of what you said about the Crimean Tatars reminded me of the experience of the indigenous Romi, the Rum, Greek Orthodox of Istanbul and Ottoman territory, who also had the exact same kinds of relationships you're describing with Muslim and Jewish neighbor and other kinds of Orthodox Christian neighbors like Armenians and Syriac Orthodox. Exactly the kind of experience, and then all of it just destroyed and taken away in the early 20th century for the exact same kinds of processes, resulting in very similar diminution of numbers and the claims on the part of the ethnic Turkish majority to the territory as theirs and theirs alone, ahistorically so. So just, yeah, fascinating stuff. I appreciate it very much. One thing I'd like to ask both of you is to maybe expand a little bit on when we think about the presence of these minority communities and their connections with their co-religionists, I guess one thing I'll ask to Olena first. What kinds of connections do Crimean Tatars have with their co-religionists and their community members in other parts of Ukraine? I mean, are they able to contact people elsewhere in Ukraine, or do they have a special kind of difficulty given the severity of the occupation in Crimea?
Now, after occupation, after 2014.
Yeah.
Actually, the problem is that I have no access to the field now, and I don't know how it is acting. I know that there are a lot of Crimean Tatars in Kiev and other cities of Ukraine. They moved there in so-called continental Ukraine, as they're saying. Yeah, because of political persecution, political repressions in Crimea, especially on religious on religion issues. So somebody moved not because of that, because they don't want to. They want to have more freedom, but they left their families, elderly people in Crimea, so they always have such connections with the peninsula. Their connections with big families are really, really strong, and they always have, as I know, people who don't afraid much of being imprisoned, so they can cross the border. And from time to time, now I think it's impossible because of the war. But previously it was really a common thing. And this interconnections between Crimean Tatars on the continental Ukraine in Crimea is really, really strong.
Okay, that's very helpful. To Catherine, so you mentioned before about the presence of ethnic minorities in or their outsized influence in public discourse in Ukraine. So how would you characterize the role that, say, some of these Crimean Tatar leaders in Kiev in mainland Ukraine, what kind of role do they play in the Ukrainian Council of Religious Organizations? Like, what kind of role do they play in public discourse, would you say, right now?
I would say Crimean Tatars play quite a significant role. As Olena said, they are an indigenous people to Crimea, and they have a pronounced pro-Ukrainian political position, and they have always, since Ukrainian independence, been fairly vocal about their support for Ukrainian independence. If you think back to 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Crimea was at that time part of Soviet Ukraine because of an administrative reorganization that Nikita Khrushchev did that joined the Crimean Peninsula to Soviet Ukraine. And at that point, because of the deportation and many other factors, Crimean Tatars were pro-Ukrainian and were vocal in their support for Crimea remaining part of Ukraine. And of course, since the war, they have continued this strong support for Ukrainian sovereignty. And as Olena mentioned, many have come to continental Ukraine, where they are once again advocates for turning back the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. So in that sense, they're quite vocal, and their own particular history, of course, provides additional evidence for the perils of being under Soviet and then subsequently Russian domination. So their whole experience speaks to an endorsement for Ukrainian sovereignty. I would also mention that in speaking of larger networks and religious organizations, the Crimean Tatars received various forms of charitable assistance and other kinds of exchanges with a variety of Turkish organizations, of course, prior to annexation. Crimean Tatars are part of the Spiritual Administration of Muslims of Ukraine, which unites a variety of Muslim communities, including Crimean Tatars, but also including the Muslims who live in Ukraine who are from other former republics of the Soviet Union. For example, there's a notable presence of Muslims from Azerbaijan, from the North Caucasus, and of course from Central Asia. And so those Muslims, of course, previously were part of the former Soviet Union and came to Ukraine for a variety of reasons. In some instances, have split over the attitudes towards the war, but by and large, most have been, once again, quite pro-Ukrainian. And the main Muslim organization in Ukraine, as I mentioned, the Spiritual Administration of Muslims of Ukraine, has, like other religious unions that previously used to unite religious groups throughout the former Soviet Union, has split with its counterparts in Russia over the issue of the war. So there are multiple levels of expressions of both Crimean Tatar solidarity and Crimean Tatar rootedness in the Crimean Peninsula, and when that is not possible, then in continental Ukraine, as Olena mentioned. So I think this begins to explain, once again, their very prominent role in defining Ukrainian positions. And I mentioned the role of religious organizations in articulating what constitutes a just war. It's going to be far more difficult to begin to articulate what constitutes a just peace. But of course, this long-standing allegiance of Crimean Tatars to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian cause, and to the Ukrainian state, this underlines then a commitment to a just peace, including a rollback of the annexation of Crimea, which may or may not be possible, but no doubt it's that bond between the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian people and Crimean Tatars and the allegiance that comes from it that will certainly push for a reversal of the Russian annexation of Crimea as part of a just peace to end this conflict.
Again, so many good points. And I especially, just to recall, to reemphasize to people, I think it's helpful to emphasize your point that, as you put it, the Crimean Tatar experience is, as you say, to use your very apt phrase, a very powerful affirmation of the need for Ukrainian sovereignty. I mean, that's a very, very important point to stress. I appreciate that. We have a great question here from Dr. Heather Coleman. What a fascinating panel. On the Ukrainian mainland, the Nazis also accomplished a transformation of the landscape by erasing the fact that most of the towns west of the Dnipro were majority Jewish, and similar pre-revolutionary accounts of Jewish and Catholic presence at religious events, etc. So an interesting point here about Jewish and Christian Roman Catholic interrelationships destroyed by Nazi ethnic cleansing and genocide as well, which is a very, very helpful point that I appreciate. It's such a fascinating dynamic. The point too about the Turkish connection with the Tatars is also helpful. Yeah, again, it's a very important comment. I mean, the point here about how surprised people can be to hear these sorts of things. Yeah, this has been my experience as well. I mean, it is as Dr. Coleman here says, Ukrainians are often surprised to hear about this particular kind of Jewish-Christian interaction here in this territory before Nazi violence. Yeah, it is surprising to people. Lots of people, when I taught about history with Orthodox and Muslim interaction, there's all kinds of surprise that there were these common histories for so long with such deep and local inflection. It's hard to imagine, but as was pointed out before, historical memory preserves these things. They still exist among people's practices and memories, even if they feel kind of distant. And yeah, the Turkish example and connection is very helpful too. Especially going back to the Ottoman period when the Ottoman Empire accepted the refugees from the Circassian genocide, when Circassian Muslims were pushed out of Russia in the 1860s and they went to the Ottoman territory, speaking a language that I now realize is very similar to Turkish. Every time you've used Crimean Tatar phrase, I need to go learn Crimean Tatar because it sounds very, very similar to modern Turkish. And the practices described here are very, very similar to Ottoman Turkish practice. I mean, very similar. The way you talked about saint shrines and things are not just analogous, but identical to folk traditions in Turkish and Balkan territories as well, which is also very interesting. So I appreciate everyone's contributions very much. I think that, again, this is fascinating information, and I want to stress to people who are watching this now or later, this is information that I think is really important and very hard to come by about this topic. And so I appreciate y'all's contributions to it. And I hope this panel is interesting to those now watching it and who will watch it later. So thank you very much again for being here. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.